So I am hugely honored and grateful for Ebony and David's enthusiasm in inviting me tonight or today or whatever. I don't know. It's dark and it's like a long winter ahead here. But I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. But no, really, I'm so humbled and so excited to be able to share with you today. And I was rereading the flyer that circulated to get you here. I mean, we're going to hit some of it, so just like, I hope that's okay. But really, I'm chuckling a little bit because as I was structuring the talk, I was like, oh, right, veterans. So I'm going to say a name right now, Mary Walker. And you might know the name, might live large in your mind, may not. But if you know the name Mary Walker, anyone know the name Mary Walker and why it might be relevant for women veterans? I have not worked with her. I can't claim that. But I will say that she was one of the first women awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was awarded to her for her service on the battlefield in Civil War, particularly her medical provision. She was a physician and she was helping on the battlefields. So we'll come back to Mary Walker. But I wanted to bring her into the space and our conversation today because in many ways, Mary Walker sort of embodies what is great and not so great about being a resilient leader, right? There's some wonderful ways that resilient leaders who often are formed because of really difficult moments in their journey, but there are wonderful ways in which they can really see through BS and understand exactly what needs to actually be accomplished in order to affect some greater outcome. And Mary Walker certainly had that ability. And the women that I was lucky enough to work with over the academic year of 22 and 23, they had that ability as well. And it was an honor to be able to create a program that helped them see that and recognize that. There wasn't really much that we did in our program curricular-wise that really accounts for what the women did with the program. It was really already there for them. I think we just created a space very intentionally that allowed them the opportunity to be vulnerable enough to actually see that for themselves. So we're going to talk about strength and vulnerability and resilience. But first, we're going to talk a lot about me. For some reason, Ebony thought that was useful. I am happy to indulge. If you get bored, I won't mind. Okay. So before we get into me, I want to share this scene. This is a photo from June 2020. And it was definitely a moment of pause for me and my life. It was a moment of pause for much of our nation. And it may have been a moment of pause for you as well. And I want you to just take a minute, and it doesn't have to be June 20, but I just want you to kind of consider a moment of pause in your life, something that has brought you to a pause. And it doesn't have to be a long one. It doesn't have to be, completely getting out of town, just cause you to really stop and consider and reflect. So I want you to get that in your head, okay? And then we're going to do a little bit of gossip, okay? It's good stuff, though. So that moment that caused you to pause, there's something that's come out of that for you. And there might be some pain, there might be some negative emotions about that pause or something that came out of that, but there's probably some quality or characteristic or space that you are seeing anew because of that pause, because of that moment. And so our positive gossip opportunity is for us we can get up and move about the cabin if we want, or we can just gossip with our mates here. But I want you to think about that positive that has come from that pause and to gossip positively with others about it. The reason it's called gossip is when we do a report out, it won't be you reporting your gossip. It'll be someone else. So that's how it becomes gossip. Okay? But you're giving them permission because don't tell them what you don't want them to repeat. Okay? So there you go. this is your prompt, and you got a few moments to share. I want to just get a little bit of a read of some positive gossip you captured in that recent conversation. Anyone want to gossip? Y'all are so well behaved, kind, and generous people. Thank you. I knew you had it in you. Thank you.
So she shared with me, her issue she may have had with her father recently within this year, and out of it, they gained a better relationship. So like, they went through something together and they created a bond, and now their relationship is even better than what they were.
I need to have some time with you because I literally did not pick up the call that my dad just made because I know it's about Christmas Eve and I can't even. So later, you and me. Thank you. Good to know where the resources are in the room. Yeah, maybe it was the image I chose, but I could just overhear and y'all just went in for it. You weren't even we weren't even gonna get names first. We were just so here it is. Yeah. Anyone have a real hard time coming up with a time they had to pause? No. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. But I'm just so I did get names, Teresa, and I'm just so happy to be in a group where you acknowledge a challenging time and you grew from it. I was thinking I guess I'm still growing, or maybe there's no challenges right now. Not true.
Mine anywhere.
Yeah, right. And also, you had to give yourself permission to sort of get into that headspace of being vulnerable and of sharing, right? Because we could have just kept this light and breezy, but not me. So here we are. So this, like I said, this was a moment of pause for me in my life. And I want to tell you a little bit about why that was. So how I came to even come to Columbia and Barnard a couple of years back was because I started a lab. And actually that lab began during 2019 and 2020. I happened to be on sabbatical. And when you are a mom of 5 children who are still in school, definitely the 1920 year is the year to be on sabbatical. Definitely turned into a homeschool principal and failed miserably. I don't know how I'm an educator because I'm not. But adjacent to my own growth was my recognition that I had gotten to a place in my career, and really we had gotten to a place in our communities that, the same old sort of model wasn't really functioning the way that I think it needed to function in what I saw as the years ahead. And it turns out I wasn't wrong. So interesting there. But for me, the growth of my lab and the formalization of my scholarly work in a lab came about because I recognized that we are in a moment where more people need to be empowered to make tough calls and to do them humanistically and holistically. And also, you want to ban books like there's no tomorrow. So how do you get real interesting information out into the world? And I decided that play and play-based opportunities were really important in that effort. So this is what my lab does. On one side of the house, we work with organizations to cultivate leaders who can really lead through difficult times with an ethical and moral compass and their identities intact. I think that's really important. And also, we make games. And it was really me trying to be subversive. You're going to ban a book about medical history because it happens to kind of expose some systemic racism. Well, I think maybe medical providers need that information as they're developing into their professions. So that became what we do. And our first game was called Bad Call. It's a card game. You play through 69 cards, and as you do, the story of a first responder community unfolds. And you are collectively, if you're playing with a group of people, or individually if you're journaling it yourself, but you're creating a story of a character who lives in this community. And it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it starts with a tragedy, it ends with a tragedy, and you get to navigate all the tragedies between. So it's a really uplifting, fun game, and like lots of replayability. But also in the prompts and on the cards, we embedded resources that were curated by the Office of Victim Services, specifically for high demand workforces. So EMS, victim services, law enforcement, fire, and safety. And they have 500 resources in what they call the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. And our game curates about 25 of those, really highlights them and makes them available. So whether you use them when you're playing or you simply have this interesting deck of cards that goes right to some resources, there's lots of ways you could use the game. So we're very happy that it's now been about 5 years since our lab has been operating, that we're just about ready to have like a storefront where you can like purchase this and get it mailed to you and use it with people you care about. So we're so excited about that, but we're still trying through that. This is members of my lab team. We do a showcase every other year. So this was our 23 showcase, and we work with undergraduate students. Very lucky to be able to take that income that our lab generates from technical assistance work and use it to support a game designer in residence and some of our student scholarships and conference presentations. So I had to find some ways that undergraduate students could do some really meaningful work at a level that was clinically impactful, that didn't require the kind of clinical licenses and supervision and all of those kinds of things that real clinical direct with patient work requires. So the game resources and developing those is a nice complement to what our students already want to be doing. And it gives them a chance to also be creative, which is wonderful. So I said we're going to talk a lot about me. This is about me. Okay. There's a lot going on here. And so what was that pause about in 2020? Certainly that pause was about my scholarship and its sabbatical. I get to sort of think through what I want the next chapter of my career to look like. Let me formalize some of the fun things I've been doing in my professional work and in my community service and make a lab out of it. So that was a big push. But you might get a sense that I'm a bit booked and busy when you look at this slide. And absolutely, this was like my ego boost of like, oh my God, I can't function during the pandemic. I'm failing at everything. I'm over my book deadline. I can't even do anything. So let me remind myself of the things I've done. So I come back to this every once in a while just to remind myself. But what you're seeing also is my attempt to make myself coherent. Like, I do so many things. What is this about? And there is some coherence, and I promise we're going to get there. Mary Walker's involved. It's great. But on the top, what you're looking at are, formal training and certifications that I've acquired and the organizations that I did that with. In the middle, you're really looking at my heart, my community service, how I've directed myself. And almost all of those have been in the town that I graduated high school in. So if you want to know how to get inducted into your high school Hall of Fame, maybe it's your military service, or maybe you can just be booked and busy for some really important years of your life and miss out on bedtime with your kids. So I don't know, your choice. Think about it. And then along the bottom, some of the acknowledgments and awards that I've received over my career. The Glamour Magazine Top 10 College Women was one of the first times I got a trip to New York and a makeover. And I learned some important lessons. Yeah, I know. Yep. I did not get the beautiful blowout. I got an afro I wasn't expecting to rock, but I really rocked it, and it kind of changed my senior year. So it was actually not so bad. You see on the top, very top, sort of my scholarly contribution areas, and along the bottom, my creative writing areas, because in addition to the work I do in my lab, one of my self-care activities is writing. And when I'm not beating myself up over missing deadlines, it's actually a really wonderful outlet for me, because no one can argue with you on the page, unlike every other part of my life. So I really appreciate the page. But I want to share a little bit about some through lines that are maybe not visible here. I mentioned that a lot of that service work happened right in my hometown. I was a first-generation college student. I was a nurse's aide by the time I was in my sophomore year. I had self-emancipated by the end of sophomore year, beginning of junior year. and was supporting myself through high school and then eventually into college. And that's hard. It's hard being the first. It's hard not knowing what you don't know about environments and the tasks before you and norms. And I'm not someone for norms. So like that was already hard. But it was because of that outsider experience that when I got to places where there was actual community and resources and support, which wasn't always the case outside of some of those early environments, it meant that I recognized opportunities for more community and more resource and more, and I don't just mean in a financial sense, but of course that's real too. But once you see a place that's safe and home, you want to work to help make that true for anyone who comes into that space. And also to like take that out, right? Like it doesn't have to just be in this one box. It should be all over, right? And so that was deeply motivating to me. And it explains a lot of my pathology as well as the things on the slide. And really the combination of those things, like you could make your pathology work for you sometimes. But it was oftentimes the logos get on here not just because the work was meaningful to me, but also because it was work that needed to happen, right? So I've worked with housing organizations because, you know what, we've never had enough housing. And we are talking about it now in different ways than we have before. But it's been a perennial issue. And it was certainly an issue that I faced as a young adult, becoming an official young adult, but even as a self-emancipated minor. We're going somewhere and I'm getting a little lost. So, okay, there we go. All right, so that's where we're going. The journey that I started on and the Glamour Magazine Award, it really highlights another kind of pause in my life. And that was at the end of college. The work that I started to do by the end of my junior year of college was with women prisoners. And when you are a student on a predominantly white campus, religiously affiliated school, didn't have gates because it was too rural to need them, but could have had them. And then you go behind bars and you realize like where you feel comfortable, that's a reason to pause, right? I felt really comfortable behind bars. Those were my people. And I didn't have their record and I didn't have the exact story that they had, but I had a lot of similarities in my story to their story. And the difference was that I had a full scholarship to my college and I didn't really have to worry about food, right? And I didn't have an abusive lover. Those were like really key differences in my story versus their story. But that was also my awakening into what my discipline of psychology could really bring to the world as well. So it was sort of this weird experience of I felt really comfortable behind bars, except for the warden didn't like my concert t-shirts. And but I really liked what I was learning in my classrooms because I could understand and I could share what I was learning with these women, and they were finding it so amazingly helpful. So that's really powerful when you have that happen in college, when you have that kind of a local impact. I ended up generating several reports that were referred to for decades afterwards that helped us rebuild a system for women prisoners, helped us modify and change some of our reunification processes for women who were released from prison. So it was really impactful work. And it was also not something that I was ever recognized for at the time. And that really hurt, right? I understood what was possible and I wanted to share that out both in the prison walls and outside. And then eventually it did get shared, but it wasn't attached to my name. Someone else took credit for it. And it was a moment in my career where at the time I was a professor at that point. And, you know, I was a professor who within 18 months of this happening would be denied tenure. I was able to fight and become tenured regardless of that. But 18 months before I was denied tenure, senior colleagues took my undergraduate work and used it as their own. And my chair at the time, knowing that, you know, I needed to focus on eyes on the prize, you're not here to look back, you're here to look forward. He said, you have a choice, right? You can definitely pursue this, But how did you come to learn about this? Oh, it was this report. It was on NPR, and they were reporting on this, and I know those numbers because those are my numbers. I remember those numbers. And, he said, so it's getting out there. And I thought, okay, right, because that's the work, right? The work is getting out there. So there were moments of pause for me, and there will, I'm sure, continue to be. But each of those moments helped me observe opportunities that I could be in my own feelings, in my own head, in my own thoughts about what should happen, or I could take advantage of what was before me and celebrate what was happening. And I'm not saying that we never make change, because that's important too, but those were really important lessons for me. And as I did this exercise of, I can accomplish something sometimes, except for deadlines, it brought me to a moment, and I started to really recognize some common threads across my work. I mentioned women prisoners. I had an opportunity in graduate school, early graduate school. I attended Fordham, and was able to work in several veteran affairs hospitals over my early clinical years. And it was there that, by the time I was doing that, Iraqi Enduring Freedom was unfolding. And so we know the proportion of women veterans during those conflicts skyrocketed, and the number of responsibilities and the kinds of positions that they held really increased, as well as military sexual trauma rates. And so that was another area where I saw impact, both in terms of supporting women veterans themselves, but also in my pre-doctoral years had to, while serving within a VA setting, had to really advocate to our senior leaders that we were, as women of color clinicians, consistently harassed whenever we were in our workplace. And it was something that was pretty invisible to senior leaders, and something that was really uncomfortable for us as an intern cohort to come together and say, we need to make some change here, but really important. And, I can't say that it had the seismic impact of, say, Me Too by the time 2017, but for the early 2000s, we made some people do some things that they hadn't done before, which was a step. Additionally, I mentioned that I was self-emancipated. I was a licensed nurse's aide, so entered healthcare early. I was 16 when in my first healthcare job. I had seen my step-grandmother be a nurse, and so I understood that that was a profession that really mattered. And so that's what I thought my own career would be focused on. I started college as a nursing major, and then it was realizing I wanted to be a nursing major so I could work in Planned Parenthood. So I thought, maybe I just want to help women. I think that's what I actually want to do. So, so I changed that course to be focused on psychology. But I was raised in an evangelical community. And then my formal education happened in Catholic institutions. So church with big C, small c, lots of different C's, and then higher ed. And I really had to think about what are the through lines there. And here you go. Hierarchical, narrow-oriented, and I don't say dominated, I say oriented, and mission-driven. And all of those qualities are true throughout all of the systems that I've just named, right? And so an individual's experience and journey through any of those systems, in whatever role they wear, is going to be deeply affected by the way that they are showing up and by how others are perceiving the way they show up, right? So that was kind of striking to recognize, I'm comfortable inside prisons. I'm, comfortable working with highly traumatized populations, right? Why? Oh, these are really familiar dynamics, right? And if you're someone who's survived domestic violence or had domestic violence in your home, these are probably also really familiar dynamics, where there's sort of a need to protect the institution and the good work that it can do. But sometimes the reality of being in that space and serving in that space can be really, really difficult. So it wasn't a complete line. There's a little bit of circularity to this story that I'm sharing with you. But that work that I'd done with women prisoners, my own survivor story, the work that I was really engaging with academically, was all focused around trauma. And in the late 90s, that was a good time to be focused on trauma because we were starting to have language for trauma that we had not had earlier. 1992, Judith Herman wrote a book. Oh my gosh, it just fell out of my head. I'll get back to it. It's amazing. You all will read it and it'll be transformative for you as well. Trauma Recovery, I think that was the name of it, maybe? Yeah. And so she talked about the universality of trauma. She talked about research on combat veterans and the research on domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, the research on child abuse, and the research on occupational abuse. And trauma is trauma is trauma. And of course, that isn't to diminish it. But in terms of our physiology and our psychology and our interpersonal spheres, the nature of the traumatic event often matters less than the physiological, interpersonal, and psychological impacts that unfold from it. So what you are seeing taped up on the wall over here really comes out of that work that I started as an undergraduate and that I've devoted my career to, and that's trauma-informed capacity building. So in the 90s, there was an important study called the Women Co-occurring Disorder and Violence Study. It tracked programs that were treating women with co-occurring addiction and PTSD, tracked them for 5 years, as well as their children. And some of the settings where the women were receiving care were gender-specific and trauma-informed, meaning they were trying to capture these 6 qualities. There's 5 slides, but there's 6 qualities because I combined one. Trying to understand if you look at treatment as usual, sort of rehab, 12-step programs, or these approaches that were specifically informed by gender and trauma history, do you see an improved outcome? And I'll get to the punchline. It was a little mixed and there's a lot of issues with fidelity, but long story short, that effort really helped to form a way of working with survivors that has transformed almost every service sector since then. So it won't be hard to know the term trauma-informed. You've probably heard it. If you've ever taught, you've probably learned about trauma-informed education. If you've worked in occupational therapy, you've probably been informed by trauma-informed occupational therapy. So trauma-informed everything, I'm a big proponent, but these are some qualities and principles that when an organization that supports a survivor or when a clinician supports a survivor, these principles can be very transformative and guiding. The idea of choice and collaboration. The door that is opened to a survivor is not probably the door that they most need, right? So that door needs to meaningfully connect to the things that they really need. And we can't do that if we're not collaborating both as individual practitioners and as systems. And if the individual doesn't have choice in what door they're opening to get the help they really need, that's another problem that will fail a survivor. Trustworthiness and the ability to be reliable, hugely important, because that's kind of the thing about trauma is you don't get to choose stuff and you can't predict and people don't have boundaries. And so all of that's really important to develop, cultivate, and instill in a particular setting. Empowerment is another big focus. And when I thought about my own survivor journey, or I thought about any of the individuals I worked with in these settings, it was empowerment that made a transformative difference. There's surviving and there's thriving. And thriving can't happen without empowerment. There is nothing that anyone outside of you can do that will be the magic wand. You have to know that it's there. And you have to be supported and allowed and given permission to reach for those things. So empowerment is vital in supporting survivors. Awareness and having everyone who's part of the system understand what trauma actually means and also what it does. That, I'm not going from 0 to 100 because I love being a bitch. Like, I'm really dysregulated. And also I might sometimes love being a bitch, but it's mostly that I'm dysregulated. And there's probably some reasons that have nothing to do with you on the end of the phone or at the front of the counter. And how do we help everyone in our system know that so that they can really receive that? Because I certainly don't want someone being a bitch to me. So, but how do you hold that tension between those who can regulate and those who need support to do that? And then finally, safety. And, yes, you have to have well-lit pathways if you want survivors to come to your door, right? And also if something bad happens, there has to be a way to make it stop and to be clear about that was bad, right? So just some basic things that I think are really important in any work that I do and in thinking about any work that an organization or a leader wants to accomplish. I always come at it from a trauma-informed mindset because I've spent 20 years doing that, because that was my training, because I've chosen to function in spaces where trauma is repeated and replicated and reified. And so these principles really are important. And I found that by the time just before my sabbatical, I had thought through some of these ideas. I'd thought through some of these interconnections. And I was at a place where before the pandemic, my children were sort of functional, right? So this was like 2018. My dog Zelda is on my daughter Zora's lap. Zora is now a freshman at Mercy up the hill. And the dog is still annoying, but is older. The dog is 6 now. And my husband and my daughter Willa, my daughter Audra, my son Langston, and my nephew Sergey. We've had Sergey since he was 3.5. He and my daughter share a January birthday, not the same date, but both the same month. And he's about to be a licensed driver, even though he hates it. He's a trooper. I'm very excited. But this time, the kiddos, you can sort of see they can manage, right? I didn't have to get anyone ready for this picture, and you can probably tell. Maybe I should have gotten them ready, but that's fine. And that was a pretty important and impactful moment for me to pause, right, professionally, to think, all right, what do I want this next thing to be? So I said that writing is therapy for me. It's a self-care practice. And so around 2018, I wrote Badass and Bold, a planning tool. And this becomes the roots of the Entrepreneurial Leadership Program that Ebony described earlier. But I just wanted to share first that it just came out of my life. Just like I have a lot of things that I'm doing, and there's a lot of things I want to do, and time is finite. And the time I have with my family is finite. And how do I make all of these things come together, right? So I really thought a lot about that, and I did a lot of different exercises and made a lot of grocery shopping lists, and way too much of that ended up in the planner. But I started with sort of writing down a manifesto, and I realized that that's a very loaded term. But for me, I just wrote 26 things. I just thought, I could think about something for 2 weeks. And if there's 52 weeks in a year, I can think of 26 things that I know to be true. And let me just meditate on these. So that's where it started. And I talked about trauma-informed principles, and the big reveal is that I overlaid some of these ideas on those principles. So we're going to rip the white paper off these shiny placards, and we're going to plant these placards around the room, and you guys are going to get to spend some time with them. But before we get to do that, I'll just kind of talk through what I was drawing both from just surviving my own existence and from some of the trauma-informed capacity work that I had been doing. So one was tending your own garden, right? You've been on the airline, you got to put your own oxygen mask on first. That's what this was about. It was just about drawing attention and focusing on what are the things that renew you when you are sharing out your talents with the world. And being conscious about what those are. It might not be a garden, but it's a useful metaphor. And I should have put this one last because it's kind of one I think is pretty critical. But and I think this is probably the developmental milestone of midlife as you start to realize that your time, it's finite. I said there was a spiral, but actually maybe it's a line. So what do you want to be left behind you? Since my earliest research work, I have been interested in ideas of generativity. It's associated with midlife. But I found in my work with survivors of any age that generativity is a real key effort, task. And it's really this idea of legacy. What will be left behind? What will generate beyond your lifetime? And so that could be, of course, a child, but it could also be a community garden. It could be a space. It could be a relational repair, right? I didn't answer my dad's call, but I have to call him back, that you made happen. And so there's lots of ways to think about generativity, but I've always known and recognized that it's really important, and particularly, I think, important for women's social development, and I think has a special meaning and impact for those who've survived trauma. The idea of being able to give back. It's really, if we look at some of those principal words, it's really empowering, right? And it can open up collaboration and can open up new relationships where trust and safety can be reestablished. So there's lots of really wonderful things that can come from it. And I found that rather than trustworthiness, I thought about the root of that, which is really attachment. And so nurturing others becomes a focus in this work as well. And again, I think very specifically for a lot of women's identity development, who we love is often who we are. And I don't mean that to say that we can't be ourselves without a partner, or we can't be fulfilled if we don't have attachments that depend on us. But we often sort of shape the opportunities and shape the contours of our life and the decisions we make in relationship with others. And that is a valuable and valued set of compasses to be oriented by. And we don't need to diminish that. We don't need to pretend that it's only about individual success or goals. It's okay, I think, in our lives to consider that we are related and relational with others. And so our own individual plans probably are going to be influenced by the people we love. And I think if we plan with that reality in mind, we're probably going to do better planning. And if we feel a certain way about having to plan with that in mind, then maybe that's telling us something too about the commitments and attachments that we've been fostering. Doesn't always tell us good things, but it could. Personal development. I think that I think humans want to grow. I think that's a core value, and it's good for us. It's good for our brains. When we learn new things, we grow new neurons, or we prune them depending on what age we're on. And that strengthens our endurance and our ability to persist even in the face of aging. So personal development is always important. And for me, and how I thought about the tool that I created, I always also think about, how do I want my gifts to show up in the world? So, and maybe that's directly tied to legacy for some folks, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. But I always think about, if I'm developing myself, well, what is it for? What do I want to use this for? And it's not to say that you don't have a right to just use it because you were interested. Like, I just wanted to do watercoloring. I liked watercolor and I wanted to take a class. That's fine. Like, great. But sometimes you are pulled towards a challenge and you want to be able to do something to address it, support it, change it, but maybe there's a skill gap, right? And so sometimes I think about that personal development and that community need, and I think, what can I do to help myself get to a place where I can be impactful? So we tried to take all of those great lessons. And I will say that despite the fact that I am not an educator, all of these humans have gotten somewhere. This is my family in June. 2024 was good that I wasn't down here doing a program, because my 8th grade daughter graduated. My daughter Zora in the middle, that's her high school graduation. My nephew behind my husband, that was a month later, was his high school graduation. And my son, who just turned 17 this month, he got his GED and finished high school early. I did not know that I was going to have such a busy 2024, trying to get these individuals on their early life paths. We're still getting there, but you know, I set something in motion. I made some planful decisions. I can't say that they all worked out, and I can't take any credit for the work that my own children have done to endure the life that we have. But time passes, right? Whether we're ready or not. And time passes for the people and the projects that are important to us. And I think we owe them and ourselves lots of opportunities to pause, right? Because the more we can reflect and think and grow, the more stable the vines that they will be climbing, I hope. So, how do you take kind of a midlife crisis mom moment, turn it into a planning tool, and then try to help some women veterans at Columbia. Well, you find some people who are also motivated to make the world a better place and to find rooms where people can be themselves. And then you network, and you get a call one day saying, we got this group and we want to bring them together. Do you think we could? And this is what grew out of that. It was a collaborative effort to really think about what do the women in the program most want to experience, and then what do we officially have to provide because it's a program. Right? So it was a little bit of a meeting in the middle. I'm pulling all of these things together from the original material that we used. But in our first day, we sort of set the stage that this is about you as a leader, whether you see yourself in that way or not, and whatever space that is. Even if it's your dorm room, it could be there. But if it's more than your dorm room, it can be there too. And we really tried to be wherever the women in the program were going to start from. Some of them had several high-profile leadership roles that they were already serving in, and others had never considered even being a part of an organization, and that itself was new information for them. So we really tried to create a program that would fit no matter where the women were themselves. Here's kind of the very overview slide of the ILFP program, and it was trying to do a couple of different things. Part of that is because of this paradox. So I've talked a lot about myself and some of my personal and professional journeys. And I mentioned that I'm a clinical psychologist and I draw from trauma-informed capacity building. Well, over the course of the sort of history of trauma-informed work in the past 2+ decades, we've also seen a growth in something called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And sometimes we add letters to that because we recognize that race and social class and other distinguishing features are part of those adverse experiences. That wasn't the original model, so that's why we have to add letters. But that work, combined with some biological work, shows us that we are changed by trauma. And not only we are changed, but 3 generations of us are changed if we're women and we have ovaries, because all of our ovaries are in our bodies. So prenatally, whatever happened to my mother, it's happening to my daughters. Right? And my mom went through a lot of trauma when she was pregnant with me. And a lot of moms do. Right? So I recognize that paradox of we are changed physiologically, and also we can change our physiology, right? So it's not just one directional. It sounds really terrible and tragic if we think about it as just one directional. It can also change, and environment can do a lot to reorganize our systems. But I recognize that the program would not be well served by only focusing on sort of your purpose and your passion, because the paradox of purpose and passion is that you will age faster than your non-traumatized peers. Yay, trauma keeps paying off. So fun. Your telomeres get shorter faster than other people's, and that's sort of equivalent to the length of your life. So fun. And so if we don't build leaders up from both the outside and the inside, we're setting them up, right? We don't need to just be gritty. We need to be connected. And there's a lot that has to happen for connection to really be possible. And oftentimes it starts with ourself and our own knowledge of ourselves. So the program included both individual coaching, assessment, as well as the group sessions. And this was the message that we were trying to convey, and we revisited throughout the program. That combination of individual work and time, as well as the community cohort work and time, would make the difference. And we did. What did we do? So I talked about some assessments. We used a tool called the Bessie, Behavioral, Emotional, Social Skills Inventory. And it was not designed for adults per se. It was designed to understand the impacts of social emotional curriculum, K through 12. So it was like, well, we'll see. This is interesting. Let's look at this. So the blue slides are always before. The orange slides are always after. I know it would be helpful if I organized this as a grid and showed you all the changes, but we had such a small sample size that we weren't looking to try to do statistical analyses on this. We were just sort of doing some visuals. But what the Bessie looks at is these different types of skills. And there are items associated with each of the bullet points, and then they come together as these what we call subscale scores. And so the range was from 0 to 100, and the range for our participants was, I think, from like 20 to 100. So there was quite a range. The blue background slides are the before, the orange are the after. So for this participant, we can see some slight changes in those self-management skills and the emotion resilience skills in particular, but the top two also increased. But not everyone's goes up, and that's okay, because this was really, and the way that we use this tool was also really about education. Sometimes these were the first conversations women were having about these different areas. Like, they never thought about how they function in one space versus another type of space. How, if I think about planning and organizing, I can totally do it. But if I think about like not being a bitch to people, that's really hard, right? I'm just, self-referencing here. So, and so sometimes that meant people didn't see increases. Sometimes their scores dropped in certain areas. So here we have somebody who, felt really confident sort of overall about, that compound skills. Like, when it really comes down to it, those compound skills are like really critical. Like, can you adapt, right? Huge. Everything else is kind of gravy, but if you can get those bottom three, so that's pretty great. But I interpreted that drop oftentimes as their own increased understanding of what those questions were really getting at, and their sense of permission they had to kind of be like, oh, you know what, I don't actually have it all there. So I could be wrong. We were exploring this tool, but we found it useful in our conversations. So I said that I wanted to give you a chance, all the wonderful things, yay, there we go, to have a little bit of an experience like the women in the program. You can move about the room. I'm going to go ahead and take down the placards, and I'm going to plant them on tables. And I have sticky notes. Everyone loves sticky notes. I have semi-sharpened pencils and a couple of pens. And you can visit the tables. You can chit-chat. And if you can just look at the prompt, I'll take off the paper. You'll look at just the terms that I use in my book. And you can think about this next year. Sort of take this as a little vision session for yourself. Write something on a sticky that you would associate with any of these 5 areas. And that's the task. All right. We'll come back and I'll finish Mary Walker's story. I know Mary Walker because she was, her pension and her Medal of Honor was taken from her. And it was taken from her because she was very fond of pants. Very fond of pants. She really advocated, early and often, that women should be able to wear the clothes that their duties demanded of them. And was not circumspect about her beliefs in any way. She's a bit of a rabble-rouser. And that rabble-rousing in 1917, she served on the Civil War battlefield, so we know those dates. Congress decided that she didn't deserve her pension or her medal because of misogyny, right? So I think that's tragic. It hurts me and breaks my heart to know and recognize that in her later years, her government betrayed her. There's really no other way of framing that, I think. But she lives on, and she lives on as an example not only of the harm that institutions can sometimes enact on others, but, she was true to herself. She knew what wasn't right, and she stuck to that with such clarity that a bunch of men decades later got all twisted up over it. And probably other things too. That I'm definitely simplifying this biography, by the way. So I leave you with that. I don't know what your legacies are going to be, but make some noise. And I hope that you take something from here that fills your cup and allows you to renew when you need it. Thank you so much for spending time with YouTuber.